you and your people, you went through a period of turbulence and constant change in the 7 years you were the CEO of Pearson. First of all, would you agree with this assessment that you did go through this turbulent period? And would you like to add anything else about the context you inherited back in 2013?
Yeah, I think the main thing I'd add is that I think most large incumbent companies that have been around in business for any period of time, and Pearson's over 175 years old, are going through a major digital transformation, and that's what I thought we were about to accelerate. We've got to go harder and faster. There's a clear digital transformation. What we found instead that we didn't see at the time, lurking in the murks of the business, was that we were actually going to go through a very, very significant digital disruption, where the very basis on which we made money was going to be fundamentally broken. And just to give you a couple of data points on that, in the year before I became CEO of Pearson, we sold 20 million college textbooks in America.
Right.
And students spent on average about $650 per year on textbooks and the like. By the time I finished, we were selling closer to 1 million textbooks a year, and the amount that students were spending on their courseware had halved from $600 to $300. Wow.
Can you give us a few of the major obstacles or major setbacks you encountered along the way over the 7 years you were CEO?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing was there was a major strategic challenge that we had to face that you alluded to in your introduction, and that was that we were riding three horses.
Yeah.
Education, which was both publishing and testing, assessment, certification, and some sort of interestingly growing digital businesses, trade books, and business newspapers and information. All three of those industries were going through major digital transformation, but the nature of them was quite different. Wow. And I remember Marty Barons, who some of you may remember, he was the editor featured in the film Spotlight about the Boston Globe's big story. And by then he'd been hired by Jeff Bezos to run the Washington Post. And he said the first casualty of disruption on this scale is sentiment. And what that meant was Pearson really still owned Penguin and the FT partly for sentimental reasons, because they were these iconic British brands and they were an important part of the story and how we thought about ourselves. But if we were going to, it became clear quite soon as we began to see the scale of the disruption we were going to face in the education business, that we could only succeed in education if we essentially exited the trade publishing and business newspapers business, and that's what we did. And that's why, if we were going to survive, if we were going to prosper, if we were going to be the world's leading digital learning company, we had to focus everything on education, and we had to take the tough decision to exit those businesses. So I think that was the big sort of, if you like, the single most biggest strategic challenge I think we had to make. Then in terms of some of the challenges, I think the biggest single challenge we faced is when I describe it as going from, selling 20 million textbooks down to one. And obviously you expect that's been because, usage didn't change. Students were still using our content in the same way. You expect a parallel growth on the digital side.
Right.
And that didn't quite happen. So the impact of the decline in the analog sales was felt much faster than the growth in the digital side, and that causes you a problem. And the other big challenge is it doesn't grow in a straight line.
Right.
What you find is it sort of stays steady for a couple of years, and then you get a sudden drop, and then it stabilizes, and then it goes again. And what that means, it's really, really hard to give the public markets any clear sense. You could give them a sense of where it's going to play out over a 5 or 10 year view, but trying to predict the next quarter or the next year's earnings is very hard. And that's why so few companies stay public through disrupting. If you look what happened in the music industry, every one of the major music players went into Chapter 11, went through different private equity owners, and now that they're through the other side, they're coming back into public ownership. all our major competitors in college publishing either went through Chapter 11 or were taken private and went through various different owners. We did all that. We went through this as a public company, and that's a really hard thing to do.
You talk about the public markets and telling them in a way that it's going to be a journey of transformation. It's going to take a long time. And at least at the beginning, it's more likely to go down before you actually see the upside and so on. So it's one thing to persuade the public markets. But let's talk about people and your employees, you and your employees, because the same message you were giving to the outside market, you were giving to people inside. And the reason I want to talk about that is because as an academic, I know that one major ingredient in making people more resilient is hope that what they are doing will get them the results. And again, maybe allow me as an academic to just give one academic study on this one. There's a very famous study from, I think, back in the 1930s. A professor in the United States did an experiment with rats. Today it's perceived as cruelty on animals, but nevertheless, allow me to speak a little bit about it. Basically, he will put rats in buckets of water and watch how long they will swim before they gave up and drown. And what he found was that on average, they will spend about 15 minutes before they gave up and drowned. And the second experiment, he will put the rats in the water, but just when they're about to drown, he will pick them up, get them out of the water, allow them to dry, to recover, and then put them back in the water. In a way, giving them the hope that there is a way to get out of here and so on. And in the second experiment, unbelievable as it may sound, the rats continue swimming, not for 15 minutes, as in the first experiment, not for an hour, not for 2 hours, but for 60 hours. 2.5 days, they kept swimming. And this is an experiment which shows that when people have a hope that, I'm going through difficult times now, but at the end of the day, I see a resolution, I see a happy outcome. They are willing to try and again and again and again. So I'm coming back to Pearson. You said that you knew or you expected that it's going to take time to see the positive results. How did you give hope to your people? How did you make them confident that we're undergoing all this turmoil or this turbulence or these difficult times? But trust me, let's continue on this journey because at the end of the day, at the end of a few years, we're going to see some positive results. How did you communicate that message and how did you persuade them?
The lesson I'd been taught again and again was this idea that profits sustain a business, they don't define it. What defines it is doing something really important and useful to society. What I learnt is the sustaining bit is actually pretty important. And when the profits are under pressure, so are you. And it doesn't matter how purpose-driven you are as a business, if you're not making money, you're not going to survive very long. So the sustaining bit is really important, and that's why we had to take over £1 billion of costs out of the business, cut the cost base by 25-30%, this massive transformation of the whole digital infrastructure on which the company was built. But what's interesting is through that, the defining part also became more important. That what kept people going through the profits warnings and the cuts in the dividend and the loss of all these jobs was the belief that we exist to empower people to progress in their lives through learning. And the great opportunity for us was to combine sort of world-class content with assessment powered by technology and personalized learning and make it much more accessible and affordable and democratize it and all of that. And that vision really kept people going and sustained us through this period of great change.
I'm very pleased you said that, actually. You call it vision. We might call it purpose. We had a purpose, and if people believe powerfully in a purpose, they are more likely to be more resilient. And again, if I can mention another academic study, it's called Change or Die, where heart patients were asked by their doctors after their operations to go home and stop smoking, stop drinking, eat healthy, exercise, and so on. And then they followed them for a couple of years to see what they did. What they found was that most of them, all of them actually, when they went home, they did what the doctor said. But then over time, slowly, they reverted to the bad behaviors like smoking and drinking. And what they found was that within 6 months, 90% of people went back to the bad behaviors, and only 10% sustained the effort and kept on not smoking, not drinking, and so on. And when they asked themselves, what is it so different about the 10%? It was purpose. It was, why do I have to stop smoking? Why do? And more specifically, they found that the 90% were basically told, if you stop smoking and if you do all the things we tell you, you're going to live longer or you're not going to die. Whereas the 10% were given a purpose that went beyond living or dying, which is, do you want to be there when your daughter gets married in the future to walk her down the aisle? Do you want to, be able to play with your grandchildren without feeling any pain and so on? So the message there was that when people have a purpose to fight for and they believe in that purpose, it makes them more resilient. It makes them willing to keep on fighting. Even when they fall down, they will get up and fight it more. And it sounds like you had a purpose like that.
I think that, and I think it's then... I think the sort of immersion theory, which I think is what you were talking about with the experiment referred to earlier, is also the case. I would say that at the start, 10 years ago, Pearson as a company found change very difficult. Because although the company had been around for 170 years and it had been in and out of lots of different businesses and industries, I think in an analog world, you have a sort of a change and then a period of stability and then another change and then a period of stability. And in a digital world, there's this idea that Tom Friedman writes about in a book of his, which is, Thank You for Being Late, I think it's called, that as humans, we change in a fairly sort of predictable, slow, incremental way. And digital change is happening at an exponential, ever faster rate.
Right.
And what I think is a major stress and what really tests the resilience of an organization is how do you close that gap between the incremental change pace at which humans change and this exponential change of technological change. And it's why the final sort of, dear colleagues email I sent to all staff in Pearson on the day I left was to quote Bob Dylan. I said, if you're not busy being born, you're a busy dying. And that Pearson had been busy being born for 175 years and long may that continue. Because I knew that my successor would change things that I had introduced and heralded and hold dear. And it's that ability to change. And because I think digital disruption is a contact sport. It's hard, it's painful, it sort of fundamentally disrupts the business model. It makes you question everything you think you know about yourself. A few years before I became CEO, I'd been diagnosed with throat cancer, and I went through a period of treatment, and I was struggling a little bit with the sort of mental and philosophical side of it all. And I had young children at the time. I didn't really want to burden my wife and them with that. So I befriended a Benedictine priest, and he introduced me to a quote from Martin Luther, which translates from the literally as the cross tests everything. And I don't think you have to be remotely religious to understand the significance of this. It's this idea that moments of existential crisis, like being diagnosed with something like cancer, strips away all the superficial things that we think about ourselves and reveals who we actually are at our core. And I think the sort of crisis that we went through, where, the business that had been driven $2 billion in revenues and 85% gross margin just collapsed completely under our feet, required us to do something similar, to take a step back and who we are at our core. And what we discovered is what we did wasn't really analog or digital. It was, we were brilliant at convening the world's leading experts on any given subject in any given field, and taking what they knew in a way that people could learn and share in ways that were engaging and which were proven from an educational point of view, and at certifying and assessing that and doing that at every age and stage of life. And this was going to become more important as we all had more jobs and more careers throughout our working life. And that wasn't fundamentally analog or digital, but that was fundamental to our sense of purpose and identity.
Yeah. And how did you discover it at Pearson, John? Because in a way, you're saying from the very beginning, a company has a sense of why am I here? What am I adding value to? What am I giving the customers? So you had that 150 years ago, but in a way, what you're saying is that maybe over time it gets diluted or you lose it. And in times of crisis, like you just went through with digital disruption, rediscovering, let's say, that sense of identity of who you are.
And I think it was there, and that was why we had, Pearson had gone from this conglomerate to making this, it's why we chose education rather than the FT or Penguin that we were going to focus on, because we thought that's what we could fundamentally focus on. Right. But I don't think it's not enough, I would argue. It's a prerequisite, but it's not enough, because the risk is, if as a CEO, all you're talking about is, the light on the hill in 5 or 10 years' time and the big grand vision, that can actually be quite disempowering for people working in, the company every day. Because, okay, John's saying we've got to, we're going through this massive digital transformation, I'll all be right in 5 to 10 years' time. But what does this mean for me today, tomorrow? And that's why I think change is disempowering when it seems vague and abstract and far away, and change is empowering if you can make it as immediate and as concrete as you possibly can. The people who were most constantly highly rated and regarded to provide the sense of direction and the ballast and to tell it as it really were was actually that middle layer of management. And I realized they weren't the permafrost, they were the shock absorbers, because they were having to take the grand vision of the big change and translate it in what that meant for people on a daily basis. And they were having to absorb all the angst and uncertainty, and people seeing colleagues across who were losing their jobs because of the big changes and transformations they were having to make. So I realized fundamental to resilience was actually spending as much time with those people as I possibly could, standing in their shoes, listening to them, and acknowledging when things were going wrong, that it was a sign of strength to change rather than not to. And that's and so this importance about standing in the shoes of others and really understanding that, I think is fundamental.
Middle management are the ambassadors of change at the end of the day, and they are very, very important in not only communicating, but in driving the change. My question is, did you identify specific members of middle management that you're going to use and utilize? And did you train them? Did you give them any messages so that they can be the ambassadors of top management to the rest of
I would make sure whenever I was traveling anywhere in the world, I would spend serious amount of time with the middle management groups. We also went for the trendy way of describing it is radical transparency. But we would be much more open if a big change was coming up. Because I think my experience is making a big decision is the easy part. Implementing that decision is the hard part. And the more you've given everybody the context of the decision before it's made. So the thing I think a lot of companies like Pearson that have been around for a long time, that have been very successful, it tends to be quite a deferential environment. And people don't want to be seen as the naysayer, as the person who's so you get a lot of polite resistance. And so what I became to fear was the meeting after the meeting. The senior leadership team, we'd made a decision, and then everyone would go back to their own teams and tell them what we'd decided. And then implementation would slow down, because suddenly, why have they done that? And why have they done that? And the worst thing that could happen would say, well, I agree with you, but, John or the board have decided, so we've got to do it. What you need to do is get those objections up front ahead of time, so that by the time you're sitting as a leadership team and having that discussion, you already have understood and thought all that through.
Maybe one last thought, John. We know again from academic research that what makes people resilient is support. Again, from the Change or Die study, the 10% of people who sustain their change effort over the years were those that when they went home, they found support from their family in helping them to stop smoking, helping them to stop drinking, helping them to start exercising, and so on. So I'm just wondering, within Pearson, to what extent did you think about providing the organizational support that your people will need if they're going to go through this turbulent period over a long period of time?
I think people often talk about resilience as if some people are resilient and others are not resilient or organized. I don't think of it like that. I think of resilience as a resource that we draw upon at times that we need it, and then we replenish and rebuild when the pressure's off a little bit. And what I found in the organization is you would find people who would be unbelievably resilient through some really hard, difficult times. And then something relatively minor or trivial would happen and they would struggle. And what you realize then is we've just pushed them too hard for too long. And so thinking about how you do take the time to rebuild and replenish resilience, I think is sort of really important. And then I think from my own personal perspective, I have to say there were times in Pearson when I think I would have liked it if people had complimented me on anything other than my resilience, And I couldn't worry about the fact that, for 20 years, my predecessors in the industry had stuck up the price of college textbooks twice a year, massively above the rate of inflation. So we'd created this huge secondary market that was now causing us so much problem, or that there was just oodles of venture capital cash going into edtech startups that never had any chance of making a profit, but which, caused us huge disruption and challenges in the short term. What you had to focus on is, we have to shift from being a company that sells books to one that delivers outcomes. And if we help people to achieve better results and outcomes in their life, then we will do well, and we will shift from selling a product to being a business that survives on being much more of a subscription and an access-driven business. And to do that, we're going to have to massively take the costs out of the business, and we're going to have much more of a learning culture. So focus on the things that are in your control and which you can do, and accept that there's a whole load of other things over which you have no control.